G'day, how's it going? I'm doing alright and I hope you are too. In this video we're going to be seeing one of Ivanchuk's best games, his victory over world champion Garry Kasparov. It was played at Linares in 1991 and at the time it was one of the strongest tournaments ever played. Here's the cross table from the event. To give you an idea of how strong the tournament was, Grandmaster Kamsky came last. Ivanchuk beat both Kasparov and Karpov and then went on to win the tournament. Let's see the game. e4, c5, knight e3, d6, bishop b5, knight d7. This is not the main line. The main line is bishop to d7. It is considered a lot more solid, but it probably doesn't give black many winning chances. White normally takes here. And then he's got two main ideas. One of them is a positional move like c4. And then he's going to try to get a hedgehog type of position, a Marokchi bind type of position by means of d4. Pawn takes, knight takes, and he's going to put his knight here. And then eventually he's probably going to do this and put this bishop on this diagonal. White often gets a slight advantage in those positions. But it's not very much of an advantage, to be honest. World champion Magnus Carlsen has played that variation a number of times. Now, the other main line, which is a little bit more ambitious, is to castle here and prepare a quick c3 and then d4. Now, black can play knight to f6 here, but this move is a little bit risky because white can go e5. And after pawn takes, knight takes, the queen has to move. And after queen to c7, white's got ideas such as d4 takes and then bishop f4, which can become quite sharp. And as I said, I think it's quite risky for white to play that variation. So normally, most grandmasters prefer knight to c6 here. And here, white can go c3, preparing d4. Black goes knight to f6, attacking the pawn. And in this position, the best or the most dangerous move for white is to sacrifice that pawn on e4 by playing d4 immediately. The reason is, if we play rook to e1 instead, black's got enough time to set his pawns on light squares like this. So e6, d4, we exchange pawns and then we go d5. And then when the pawn goes to e5, black can put his knight on e4. And now look at this position. Okay, there are too many colors here. I'm going to remove them. The problem for white is that his dark squared bishop, his remaining bishop, is not particularly useful. I wouldn't call it a bad bishop because this diagonal remains quite useful, I suppose. But in the long run, if white's not careful, he could get into trouble because white's pawns are fixed on dark squares and black can eventually attack them. I mean, you can picture a maneuver such as bishop b7, bishop d8, and bishop to b6 in the endgame, and suddenly white has to defend that pawn. That's why most grandmasters avoid this line for white, and instead what they do here is they sacrifice that pawn by means of d4. This is a very interesting gambit. Now, black can take on e4, and then white can go d5 here. Now, the best square for that knight is a central square, so knight to e5. And then, rather than taking here, which is not that good because after knight takes, pawn takes, rook e1, the knight doesn't retreat to f6, it actually retreats to d6. And after rook takes, black can go g6. And he's threatening bishop to g7, gaining some time. It's not very clear what white's doing with those pieces. I mean, he can play bishop here. f6 doesn't work because obviously white can take it. But black could castle here, and suddenly he's threatening f6. And I don't really see a target for white. It's difficult for white to keep the initiative. If at any point white plays this move, then suddenly this diagonal is going to become stronger. Not to mention that d4 square is potentially weak. Black could maneuver his knight to d4. Very few grandmasters play this variation for white anymore because black's supposed to to have at least equal chances. So after knight e5, white goes rook to e1, and then knight takes, queen takes, and then the knight retreats here. And the logical move for white is c4. Now, there are other moves that white can explore, such as knight to a3. This move has been played in a number of games. I think it's quite an interesting idea. But this is not an opening study, so we're going to stick to c4. And now, this is quite an interesting move. It's not easy for black to choose where to castle here. Actually, I should rephrase that, because castling long here is extremely dangerous for black. If at any point black castles long here, white's gonna strike on the queen side by means of b4, opening lines there. For example, after pawn takes, we could go a3. And already you can see how dangerous these two files are going to be against that king. Don't forget that black has no pieces protecting his queen side. This is just so hard to play for black. I think this position is close to winning for white already. And I know it sounds like an exaggeration, but it's true. It's really difficult to play. So black cannot castle queenside. He can't play g6 because white can take on f6, and the pawn on e7 is pinned. So he's basically forced to move his e-pawn. He can play e5 or e6. It often transposes. And then white needs to open lines, the two central files. So taking here, and as you can see already, white's going to be able to use those two open files and attack, increases pressure against those pawns. And one of the main lines is knight c3, bishop b7, bishop g5. And after castling here, white's got moves like queen to h3. And this is still book. It's one of the main lines. e6 is not easy to protect. You don't really want to play a move like king to f7. And e5 doesn't work because we can swap queens, and when the knight takes back, we can take on e7. This just gives you an idea of how difficult this line can be. Apparently, the best move for black after bishop to g5 is h6 in this position. But you know, it's still quite a difficult position for black, and that's why so many people like this gambit line. All right, let's get back to the game. Knight to d7, the move chosen by Kasparov, and here white strikes in the center. Knight here, we castle, and you can imagine that a world champion is not going to play a move like knight takes e4 in this position, risking home preparation by Ivanchuk. I don't know what Ivanchuk had in mind here. Probably rook e1, I think, is the move that he would have played. Queen d3 is possible also, but I think rook e1 is the most logical move. And there are variations such as this one. The knight retreats, we take on c5. Then we put the bishop here, and black needs to develop. This bishop on b5 is annoying, but if black tries to get rid of it by means of a6, we can simply ignore the threat by applying knight to c3, because the capture on b5 would lead to a winning position for white. I mean, we're threatening knight d6 checkmate, but the attack, the knight c7 threat, is incredibly hard to stop. And so here, rather than taking, black would probably go e6. And here we've got moves such as knight to g5, which is a very interesting idea, because if black tries to complete his development by means of bishop to e7, then we've got this beautiful idea, rook takes. The capture here leads to what seems like a winning attack for white. You know, he's got his king still in the center. This knight c7 thread. The queen is on. That pawn is on. This looks just too good for white. So after rook takes e6, Kasparov would be forced to castle here, and then rather than retreating his rook, we've got rook takes, queen takes, bishop d6, queen moves. We trade, and now this bishop can retreat to c4. And there's a lot of pressure against that pawn. If black goes knight e5, then we can actually put the bishop on d5. And it turns out that even though black can take it, after queen takes, White's got a very nice position. Black's underdeveloped here, and there's pressure against these, there's pressure against these. This knight is coming back here. It's not going to be easy to defend that pawn on c5. It's one of those positions where the pawn structure is nearly symmetrical, but White's pieces are so much more active. Alright, let's go back to the move played in the game. Kasparov did not take on e4, he actually took on d4 instead. So queen takes, and yes, White can take on d4 with his knight also, but I think it makes a lot more sense to take with the queen in this position. We've got all those pieces developed, e5 is a potential threat, so it's a logical move. So Black goes a6 here, and then Kasparov gets the two bishops. However, his development is not particularly good, so White continues with bishop to g5, and here Black's got to make a decision. It's not an easy one. I think the most solid move is e6 in this position, and then maybe White could continue by means of c4 and then knight c3, or he could go knight d2. It's a completely different game, but Kasparov actually chose h6, and this is an invitation for White to take on f6, which Ivanchuk did. So we get this pawn structure, and even though Black's got the two bishops, the problem is those central pawns are not very flexible. Black's going to have trouble moving those pawns. He's never going to be able to play a move like e5, because that would weaken both d5 and f5. So that means he's probably going to have to play e6 at some point. But then this pawn on d6 could become a target itself. Let's see what happened in the game. White's got two different ideas in this position. He can play knight c3, playing with his pieces, or he can actually play c4. c4 is the move chosen by Ivanchuk. Let's see knight c3 here, because I think it's quite interesting. After this, Black normally goes e6, and then White's got ideas such as this one, and then queen to d3. The knight could be coming to d4 in this position. Rook c8, and knight d4, rook c5, king h1. This is quite a useful move in a position like this. White removes his king from the g file and also from this diagonal, which could be dangerous later on in the game. For example, if we go f4, maybe Black can go queen b6 already, and the pawn on b2 is under attack, and maybe Black's also threatening e5. So you can see why a move like king to h1 is so useful in a position like this. And then after rook g5, we can go f4, rook to g7, f5. And if Black had a knight on c6, he could put it here, but he hasn't got a knight. So a move like this is particularly strong because Black can never play e5. If he does, then this square becomes incredibly weak. Not to mention that this bishop looks like a big pawn. So it's difficult for Black to continue here. Rook here, attacking g2, so we protected. Queen here, and queen h3, and you can see how much pressure White's building up against e6. Rook here, knight here, a simple maneuver. White wants to bring his knight here. E5, and then knight to b3. Finally, this square has been weakened, and after h5, White simply puts his knight here, and there's no question about who stands better in a position like this. And I think this game is quite useful because it's quite instructional, because it goes to show you how difficult it is to play with the two bishops in a position like that, where those pawns, those central pawns, are not easy to manage. It's difficult to handle that position as Black. Okay, another move rather than rook from a to d1 here is knight d2, and the idea behind this move is to put out knight on c4 very quickly and attack this pawn. It is true that black can play at b5 to prevent it, but then a4 will weaken black's b pawn in the long run. So in this game, black chose rook to c8, and now after knight c4, attacking this pawn, rook to c6, he's using his rook to defend that pawn, a4, queen c7, giving up this pawn. This is quite an interesting idea. Queen takes and rook here. And it turns out that black's bishops are becoming much stronger. There's a lot of pressure against those two knights with those pieces, and in combination with the bishop here. I like this idea for black, not worrying about losing the pawn on f6. Knight e3, bishop here, queen here, and in this position, rather than winning this pawn with bishop takes, pawn takes, and then rook takes, which would lose the pawn on h6, black decides to swap queens first. Queen takes, king takes, and the pressure against white's queen side remains there. I think in this position, black's two bishops are actually quite useful, and there's enough compensation for the pawn. The game eventually ended in a draw. Now, after knight d2, there's a game where black did play b5, and then white went a4. This was played by Grandmaster Jones against Enriquez, who's a Grandmaster with a rating of 2538. And the game went on like this: bishop b7, takes, b4, fixing this pawn on b5, takes, and then knight e2. And white's trying to attack on the king side. He's got attacking chances on that side of the board now. Queen c6 was played, queen e3, king h7, knight d4, and in this position, black blundered with queen to b6. But I must say this position is uncomfortable for black already. He played queen to b6, which is a blunder because white can simply take on e6. Okay, I don't think a 25-38 red player would make a blunder like this, so this was probably a blitz game or something. Okay, so that's another idea. Alright, let's get back to the game. Ivanchuk played c4 here, and now Kasparov went e6. Knight c3. Yeah, one thing I wanted to mention, now that white has played c4, white can no longer bring a knight to c4 and attack that pawn, so it makes more sense to play e6 in a position like this. So knight c3. Now there is another idea that black can try, and he can play a move like queen to a5 in this position. The idea is to swing his queen over to the king side and then put his rook here and maybe try to attack on the king side. Unfortunately, this is not that simple. White can go knight c3, queen h5, knight d5. Already that's a threat. And if black tries to be smart with rook to g8, creating threats such as rook takes g2, and then if the king takes, queen check, and then he takes this with check and so on, white can actually play knight c7 check, king here, and take the rook. Because if rook takes pawn, well, if queen takes knight, he can just go g3 here, and if rook takes, he's got this move, king here, and after bishop to g4, white can defend with the cold-blooded rook to g1, and it looks like white simply winning this position. So yeah, queen to a5 and turning queen to h5 doesn't quite seem to work here, unfortunately. So Kasparov plays e6, knight c3, rook here, and we've got to watch out here because sometimes black can bring his queen here, attack this pawn, and then if we defend, he can go b5, and the pawn on c4 is pinned because the knight on c3 is hanging. maybe white could play a move like queen to d3 here to make b5 a little more difficult. And if queen to c7, maybe go knight d2. I guess that was possible, but Ivanchuk preferred to go king to h1. And in this position, black can try to bring his rook over to the king side. I know I'm a little bit obsessed about maneuvering heavy pieces towards the king side, but this is actually not such a bad idea. Rook to c5. The problem is, after b4, rook to h5, and black wants to go here and possibly f5 then, maybe put his bishop here, try to activate his pieces on the king side. The problem that I see here is that white can simply bring his other knight to e2 and then to g3 or even f4. I'm not sure if knight to f4 is going to work because he's always got e5, of course, but possibly just knight g3. And that rook looks totally misplaced on the king side. So Kasparov preferred to go h5 in this position, and then white went a4, which makes b5 more difficult and gains more space on the queen side. Maybe white wants to go a5, maybe not, maybe he just wants to go b4. So Kasparov played h4, which possibly threatens h3. So h3 looks like a fine move in this position. And now maybe Kasparov could have played rook to g8 before queen to c7. That pawn is on. We're protected. Then the bishop becomes active here, threatening this and then that. And then we have to go f4. And and then black can put his bishop here. And if we take that pawn, then black goes bishop here. And if we try to pin that bishop, then black's got king here. And suddenly this is pretty hard to stop with the discover attack here. Okay, white doesn't have to do any of this, of course. After f4, bishop to c6, he doesn't need to take that pawn, and you can play more reasonable moves here. Like what? I'm not sure. Possibly rook c1, intending knight d5. Maybe. Or even b5. Yeah, that looks like a more reasonable move. So in the game, Kasparov chose bishop to e7, and then white went b4. And now Kasparov tries to weaken the c5 square by means of a5, b5, and then queen c7. And now it is true that this pawn is a backward pawn. Unfortunately, black hasn't got a knight that he can put on c5. If he did, if this bishop on d7 were a knight rather than a bishop, then I think this position would be probably okay for black. But unfortunately, that's not the case. So what we do here is we defend that pawn, and after queen to c5, we don't want to swap queens. We want to keep queens on the board. We simply go queen to d3. And I must say that even though this position is probably playable for black, I think it's going to be incredibly hard to make any of those two bishops an active piece. And that's already not a very good sign for black. Rook to g8. We don't want to play a quick f4 here because it weakens the g3 square. Maybe black can go rook to g3. So we're going to play this move first. Now queen g5, that's on. We're going to defend it. And then Kasparov played queen to f4. And now I'm not sure about this move, because if white simply defends this pawn with rook to f1 like Ivanchuk did in the game, then knight e2 followed by f4, it's going to be pretty hard to stop. Another possibility here was to go b6 immediately. So queen to f4, rook here. Now the idea is knight e2 and then f4. b6. And here... yeah, so what's the difference between playing b6 now and playing it before? Okay, so if black had gone here and now rook here, intending f4, maybe black can go queen to c5. And if f4, he's got moves like rook here, and then we can trade. Yeah, it's tempting to take with the pawn here until you realize that black's king is actually quite safe. So queen takes f3, and then maybe queen to d4, and this knight is hanging, that pawn is hanging. Black seems to be getting a little bit of counterplay. Okay, so queen f4 in this position, rook here, b6, and then knight e2, queen h6. And most people will play f4 here, and white's got a slight advantage, or quite a nice game. Maybe it's more than a slight advantage. In this position, Ivanchuk did something else. He played the incredible c5. And this is a square clearance type of move, except that most of the time you come across ideas such as this whenever there's a winning tactical idea. But that's not the case here. This is a positional sacrifice. Ivanchuk thinks that that square is going to be a wonderful square for his knight, regardless of which pawn or piece Kasparov takes with. And if Kasparov takes with the d pawn, then knight c4, the pawn on b6 is under attack. There's also this square. Not an easy position to defend. For example, if rook to b8, we can go f4, bishop to c8. This bishop needs to reach this square at some point, but look at how passive those pieces are. f5. Black never wants to play this move because then his bishops are next to worthless, and white can simply go knight there, knight there. That pawn's going to be hanging. That's a total disaster, positional disaster. So maybe black can try these, and then knight f4, pressure, king g7, we take back, and then maybe e5. And after f5, black needs to close the king side, obviously, and then knight d6 with lots of compensation for the pawn. Maybe white doesn't need to take here. There are other moves, I suppose. Maybe queen e2, and if black's king tries to hide in the corner, then we go e5, and there's more pressure against e6. Okay, if black now takes this pawn on f5, then we go knight d5. Lots of pressure. Bishop d8. We take on f6. Bishop takes knight d6. And when he defends that, then we take on f5, and this looks like an amazing position for white. Just beautiful. And that king is in big trouble. Alright, so let's go back to the move that was played in the game. After c5, Kasparov took with the rook. And it makes sense to take with the rook because if we take with the pawn instead, that rook will stay behind those pawns, and it's going to be a passive rook. So I can understand why Kasparov would want to take with that rook instead of a pawn. So knight c4 now, those pawns are on. Kasparov played king to f8, and now knight takes b6. The problem for black here is that now this pawn on b5 is a protected pass pawn, which is incredibly hard to stop in many variations. And meanwhile, Kasparov has no counterplay whatsoever. There's nothing on the king side, and his pieces are piled up in the center and a little bit on the king side, but they're not really doing very much. So bishop e8 here, f4, and f5 is possibly a threat here. So Kasparov tried to prevent it by means of f5. He needs some window for his bishops and pieces. He needs to open up some lines. So pawn takes, rook takes, and now white can use the c file with rook to c1. This rook is coming to c8. Such a difficult position. King to g7, and now white's got a couple of good ideas. He can play at g4 like in the game. He wants to use the g file, and he could also play a move like knight here, attacking this bishop. For example, if rook d5 here, queen b3, or even this knight sacrifice, pawn takes, knight takes, and we're attacking rook on g8, also threatening knight to do f5. So white's getting his material back, and on top of that, this pawn still looks unstoppable. So I'm pretty sure this position is winning for white. So maybe knight c8 would have been a better move in this position. White played g4, which is not a bad move. If pawn takes here, of course, then we take back with the queen and rook, completely winning. So Kasparov played rook to c5. The problem is this rook is just about the only active piece that Kasparov has. So all Ivanchuk has to do is swap it, take, and now knight here. The bishop is on. Can't go bishop here because we've got g5. Really difficult position. He might have tried bishop here because we can't take. There's a discover attack, discover check, and then we'd lose our queen. But we can probably go after the c pawn with rook to c1. White's clearly better. Instead of that, Kasparov played bishop to f8, and this was not a good decision because now after queen to d8, this bishop is pretty hard to defend. Kasparov was counting on this trick, queen to g6, and the idea is that if we take on e8, which looks like a safe piece, suddenly Kasparov has queen to d3, not only attacking the knight but also threatening checkmate with queen here, and suddenly black is getting more counterplay than he deserves. So after queen to g6, Ivanchuk actually played f5. Can't take because then the g file is open. So if Kasparov played queen to h6, and again, if we take here, maybe Kasparov has a little bit of counterplay after queen to e3, again with the same idea. And Ivanchuk just didn't want this to happen, so he played g5 exclamation mark, queen here. Now this queen is becoming active again. So what we do is we play rook to g4 exclamation mark again. Now look at that queen. That queen is basically trapped on the king side, and those pieces have no activity whatsoever. Pawn takes is the only move. Knight here attacking the queen. The queen has to retreat. Then queen check, king here, rook to h4, and checkmate. Next move after bishop takes, rook takes. I've never seen a game where Kasparov was crashed like he was in this game. It's just unbelievable.
See the subscribe button, hug it, show it some love, but above all, click it. And don't forget to visit our website, chess.clinic.